Dawn Clark had been tending the botanical gardens at Unity Park for 8 years, and she'd learned that every species in the galaxy had different ideas about what made plants beautiful. The Rigelians preferred symmetrical arrangements that reflected mathematical precision. The Andromedans were drawn to crystalline structures that captured and refracted light, and the Zephyrians loved flowers that moved in the wind, creating ever-changing displays of color and motion. But Bolt was different. In 6 months of visiting the park's meditation garden every Tuesday and Thursday, the nervous Victorian had never once stopped to appreciate any of the carefully curated displays that Dawn had spent years perfecting. He would rush through the walking paths, his electric blue skin crackling with the bioelectric patterns that indicated chronic anxiety in his species, checking his chronometer every few minutes as if he was perpetually late for something crucial. "Excuse me," Bolt said, approaching Dawn's workstation with the jerky movements of someone who had too much nervous energy and nowhere to direct it. "I need to know about accelerated growth techniques for temporal sensitive flora." Dawn looked up from the hybrid roses she was grafting, noting that Bolt's bioelectric patterns were more agitated than usual. In 8 years of working with alien visitors, she'd learned to recognize when someone was asking about plants but really needed something else entirely. "Temporal sensitive flora? That's a very specific request. Are you working on a research project?" Bolt's crackling intensified, and Dawn could see the telltale signs of someone who was struggling with a problem much bigger than horticulture. "I am a quantum physicist specializing in temporal mechanics," he said, his words coming out in the rapid-fire pattern that Victorians used when they were extremely agitated. "But my research has reached an impasse that requires understanding biological growth patterns in accelerated time fields." Dawn had no idea what temporal mechanics were, but she recognized the desperation in Bolt's voice, the same tone she heard from visitors who came to the gardens not because they loved plants, but because they needed somewhere peaceful to think about problems that had no obvious solutions. "Bolt, can I ask what kind of timeline you're working with? Because accelerated growth is tricky. Push plants too fast, and they develop weak root systems that can't support long-term survival." "Timeline?" Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to a different frequency that Dawn had never seen before. "That is unexpectedly relevant to my research difficulties." Dawn set down her grafting tools and gave Bolt her full attention. In 8 years of garden maintenance, she'd learned that the most interesting conversations happened when she stopped focusing on plants and started focusing on the people who needed them. "Want to sit down and tell me about it? I've got tea." And sometimes explaining a problem to someone who doesn't understand, it helps you see solutions you missed. Bolt looked around the meditation garden with the expression of someone who is calculating whether he had time for conversation. But something about Dawn's offer seemed to penetrate his chronic urgency. "Very well, but I must warn you that temporal mechanics is extremely complex, and most non-physicists find the concepts overwhelming." Dawn poured tea from the thermos she always brought to work, a habit she developed after realizing that many of her most meaningful conversations with park visitors happened over shared beverages. "Bolt, I spend my days working with organisms that grow, change, and die according to natural rhythms that most people never notice. I might understand more than you think." Bolt accepted the tea with the careful movements of someone who wasn't used to slowing down enough for social rituals. "My research focuses on temporal displacement theory, the possibility of moving matter backward or forward through time by manipulating quantum field interactions." Dawn sipped her tea and watched Bolt's bioelectric patterns gradually slow as he settled into the garden's peaceful atmosphere. "Like time travel?" "Precisely. But I have encountered a problem that has stalled my progress for 18 months. Bolt's crackling resumed as he returned to his area of frustration. "All my calculations suggest that temporal displacement should be theoretically possible, but every experimental attempt fails at the moment of quantum field activation." "What happens when it fails?" "The test subject's simple organic compounds disintegrate at the molecular level. Complete structural collapse, as if the temporal field destroys the very bonds that hold matter together." Dawn found herself genuinely intrigued by the puzzle Bolt was describing. "What kind of organic compounds are you testing with?" "Standard laboratory materials, synthesized proteins, artificial cellular structures, basic organic molecules designed for quantum experimentation." Dawn paused, her teacup halfway to her lips, as something clicked in her mind. Bolt, can I ask why you're using artificial organic materials instead of naturally occurring ones? Because natural biological materials are too complex and unpredictable for controlled experimentation. They contain thousands of variables that could interfere with quantum field measurements. Dawn looked around the meditation garden, where dozens of plant species from multiple worlds were thriving together in complex, interdependent relationships that had taken her years to understand and cultivate. But what if those variables aren't interference? What if they're actually necessary components? Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted again, this time to a frequency that indicated intense concentration. Explain your reasoning. In gardening, we learned a long time ago that sterile, controlled environments produce weak plants. You need soil microorganisms, beneficial bacteria, symbiotic relationships with other species. The complexity isn't a problem to solve. It's the foundation that makes growth possible. Dawn stood up and led Bolt to a section of the garden where earth plants grew alongside alien species, creating hybrid ecosystems that shouldn't have been possible according to traditional botanical theory. See these roses? They're grafted onto Rigelian rootstock, fertilized with Andromedan crystal dust, and pollinated by Zephyrian windflowers. The complexity is what makes them stronger than any purebred variety. Bolt studied the impossible hybrid arrangement with growing fascination. You are suggesting that biological complexity provides structural stability rather than experimental contamination? I'm suggesting that maybe your test subjects are failing because they're too simple, not too complex. Maybe time travel requires the kind of robust, interconnected systems that only develop through natural evolutionary processes. For the first time since Dawn had known him, Bolt's bioelectric patterns settled into the steady rhythm that indicated deep, focused thought rather than anxious agitation. Dawn Clark, human florist, I believe you may have identified a fundamental flaw in my experimental methodology. Really? Yes. I have been attempting to achieve temporal displacement using the scientific equivalent of sterile laboratory conditions. But your horticultural analogy suggests that temporal stability might require the biological equivalent of a thriving ecosystem. Dawn watched Bolt's excitement grow as he processed the implications of her gardening observations. So instead of simple organic compounds, you'd need complex living systems? Not just complex naturally evolved systems with established patterns of growth, adaptation, and temporal development. Bolt's voice was gaining the rapid-fire quality of someone whose mind was racing through possibilities. Systems like plants. Dawn felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion. She'd somehow managed to provide insight into quantum physics using nothing but 8 years of gardening experience. Bolt, would it help if you could test your temporal field theory on actual plants? I mean, I don't understand the science, but I know how to grow things that are healthy enough to survive stress. Dawn, that suggestion might revolutionize temporal mechanics research. But I must warn you, if my calculations are correct, successful temporal displacement could have implications far beyond my individual research project. What kind of implications? Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to a frequency Dawn had never seen before. Something that looked like excitement mixed with apprehension. The kind that could change how every species in the galaxy understands the nature of time, causality, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. Dawn looked around her peaceful meditation garden, trying to process the idea that her plant knowledge might contribute to discoveries that would reshape galactic civilization. Well, she said finally, I guess we should start with something simple. What's the hardest plant you think your temporal field could handle? I do not understand the question. I mean, what's the most resilient, complex, naturally evolved plant system we could test with? Something that survived thousands of years of environmental challenges and still thrives in multiple conditions? Bolt was quiet for a moment, his bioelectric patterns cycling through rapid calculations. Dawn, based on your criteria, I believe the ideal test subject would be something like a common earth dandelion, extremely resilient, highly adaptable, capable of surviving in almost any environment, and possessing complex root systems that interact extensively with soil ecosystems. Dawn laughed. Bolt, you want to discover time travel using weeds? I want to discover time travel using the most successful survival organisms on your planet. As Dawn began planning the most unconventional scientific collaboration of her career, she had no idea that her simple gardening observations would lead to discoveries that challenged everything the galaxies. Greatest minds believed about the nature of time, reality, and the relationship between life and the universe itself. All she knew was that Bolt's chronic anxiety seemed to be fading for the first time in months, replaced by the kind of focused excitement that came from finally finding a new approach to an impossible problem. Sometimes the most revolutionary discoveries started with the simplest questions. What if we tried something different? The next morning, Dawn arrived at Unity Park to find Bolt waiting in the meditation garden with what appeared to be a small laboratory's worth of scientific equipment scattered around her. Carefully maintained flower beds. Dawn, Bolt called out, his bioelectric patterns crackling with an energy she'd never seen before. I have spent the entire night recalculating my temporal displacement equations based on your biological complexity hypothesis, and I believe we may be on the verge of the most significant scientific breakthrough in galactic history. Dawn approached the chaos of cables, monitoring devices, and humming machinery that had transformed her peaceful garden space into something resembling the inside of a spaceship. Bolt, please tell me you got permission from the Parks Department before setting up whatever this is. Permission? Bolt's crackling paused as he processed this concern. I was so excited by the possibilities that I may have overlooked certain administrative protocols. Dawn could already imagine the conversation she'd have to have with her supervisor about why the meditation garden looked like a science fiction movie set. But looking at Bolt's enthusiasm, the first positive emotion she'd ever seen from him, she found herself reluctant to shut down his experiment before it even started. Okay, what exactly are we testing here? Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted into what Dawn was learning to recognize as his lecture mode: rapid, intense, and completely absorbed in technical details. I have modified my temporal displacement field generator to accommodate living biological subjects rather than synthetic compounds. The theory suggests that plants with complex root systems and established ecosystem relationships should provide the structural stability necessary for successful temporal transport. Dawn looked at the impressive array of scientific instruments surrounding a small patch of dirt where she'd planted 3 dandelions the previous evening. So we're going to try to send these dandelions ... when? Approximately 37 minutes into the future, far enough to demonstrate successful temporal displacement, but close enough to allow for careful observation and measurement. And what happens if it works? Bolt's excitement intensified. If it works, Dawn, we will have proven that time travel is not only possible, but practical. The implications for interstellar transportation, historical research, predictive modeling, and fundamental physics would be revolutionary. And what happens if it doesn't work? The test subjects will likely disintegrate, just as all my previous attempts have failed. Dawn felt a protective instinct toward the 3 small dandelions she'd carefully planted in optimized soil conditions. After 8 years of nurturing plants, she developed emotional attachments to even the most common species. Bolt, these are living things. If there's a chance they'll be destroyed, maybe we should start with something less ... personal. Dawn, that attitude reveals precisely why your insight is so valuable. You approach these organisms as complex, valuable entities rather than expendable test materials. That perspective may be exactly what my research has been missing. Before Dawn could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Flux Harmony, the Parks Department's chief science coordinator, Regalian, whose tentacle-like appendages were currently writhing with what Dawn recognized as administrative displeasure. Ms. Clark, Dr. Harmony announced in the carefully controlled tone that supervisors used when they discovered unauthorized activities. I have received reports of unsanctioned scientific experimentation in the public meditation garden. Would you care to explain this installation? Dawn felt her stomach drop. In 8 years of exemplary service, she'd never had a disciplinary conversation with her supervisor. But she'd also never had a quantum physicist turn her workplace into a temporal mechanics laboratory. Dr. Harmony, this is Bolt, a researcher who's been developing some interesting theories about plant biology and time manipulation. You thought you would authorize experimental physics. research in a public recreation facility without consulting the Parks Department, the Safety Board, or the Interspecies Ethics Committee? Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to a frequency that Dawn had never seen before, something that looked like panic mixed with desperate urgency. Dr. Harmony, respectfully, this research could represent the most significant scientific advancement in galactic history. The potential benefits to all species. Mr. Bolt, I don't care if you're on the verge of discovering the secret of universal peace. Unauthorized experimentation in public spaces violates approximately 17 different safety protocols and municipal regulations. Dawn watched her collaboration with Bolt crumbling before it had even begun. But something about the situation bothered her more than just the administrative complications. Dr. Harmony, can I ask why temporal mechanics research would require ethics committee approval? I mean, we're talking about moving dandelions 37 minutes into the future, not conducting experiments on sentient beings. Dr. Harmony's tentacles went completely still, a reaction that indicated serious concern in Rigelian physiology. Miss Clark, temporal manipulation research has been restricted under Galactic Treaty 47B since the Chronos incident 47 years ago. Any experimentation involving time displacement requires approval from the Temporal Safety Council and monitoring by qualified paradox prevention specialists. The Chronos incident? Dawn asked. Bolt's bioelectric patterns had shifted to something that looked like fear mixed with embarrassment. A research team on Chronos Prime attempted to demonstrate time travel using advanced quantum field manipulation. Dr. Harmony explained. The experiments succeeded beyond their expectations. They accidentally sent their entire research facility 16 hours into the past, creating a temporal loop that required 3 months and a team of Galaxy's best physicists to resolve. Dawn looked at Bolt, whose nervous energy had returned with an intensity that made his earlier anxiety seem calm by comparison. Bolt, when you said this research could have galactic implications, did you mean it might accidentally affect more than just the dandelions? Dawn, I must be honest. I have never successfully achieved temporal displacement before. I cannot predict with absolute certainty what the scope of effects might be if the experiment succeeds. Beyond calculated parameters, Dr. Harmony's tentacles began writhing again. Mr. Bolt, are you telling us that you brought untested temporal manipulation equipment into a public park without knowing what would happen if it actually worked? I brought carefully calculated temporal manipulation equipment based on revolutionary new theoretical insights provided by Ms. Clark's expertise in biological systems. But you don't actually know what will happen. Science rarely progresses through experiments where the outcome is completely predictable. Dawn found herself in the bizarre position of mediating between a panicked supervisor and an overly enthusiastic physicist while standing in a meditation garden that had been converted into a potentially dangerous laboratory. Dr. Harmony, what would it take to make this experiment officially authorized? Months of paperwork, safety assessments, environmental impact studies, temporal paradox modeling, and approval from at least 6 different regulatory agencies. And how long would that process take? Assuming favorable reviews at every level, approximately 18 to 24 months. Dawn looked at Bolt, whose bioelectric patterns had gone completely flat with disappointment. Bolt, I get the impression that waiting 2 years might not be ideal for your research timeline. Dawn, temporal mechanics is an extremely competitive field. If I delay experimentation for 2 years, other researchers will undoubtedly develop similar approaches and achieve breakthrough results before I can demonstrate the validity of our biological complexity hypothesis. Our hypothesis? Yes, your insight about natural ecosystem stability was the key theoretical advancement that made this experiment possible. Without your horticultural expertise, I would still be failing with sterile laboratory compounds. Dawn felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. Support Bolt's potentially revolutionary research and risk her job, public safety, and possibly temporal paradoxes, or follow proper protocols and watch a breakthrough discovery get buried in bureaucratic delays. Dr. Harmony, what if we could find a way to test the theory safely, with proper oversight, without violating any regulations? Ms. Clark, temporal manipulation research cannot be made safe through minor procedural adjustments. The risks are inherent to the technology itself. But what if we could test the biological complexity theory without actually doing time travel? Both Bolt and Dr. Harmony looked at Dawn with expressions of puzzled interest. Explain your reasoning, Miss Clark. Well, Bolt's theory is that naturally evolved biological systems provide the structural stability needed for temporal displacement, right? What if we could test that stability hypothesis using existing scientific methods without actually activating the temporal field? Bolt's bioelectric patterns began shifting to what Dawn recognized as intense intellectual processing. You mean test the quantum field interactions without attempting temporal transport? Exactly. Prove that complex biological systems respond differently to quantum fields than simple compounds. Establish the theoretical foundation and then apply for proper authorization to test the actual time travel component. Dr. Harmony's tentacles had shifted to a pattern that indicated cautious consideration. That approach would still require safety oversight, but it would not fall under temporal manipulation restrictions if no actual time displacement occurs. Bolt was quiet for several minutes, his bioelectric patterns cycling through complex calculations. Dawn, your proposed methodology is scientifically sound and ethically responsible. It would also provide the experimental data needed to support authorization requests for full temporal displacement testing. So we can still test your theory, just ... More carefully, we can test the foundation of the theory in a way that advances the science while respecting safety concerns and regulatory requirements. Dawn looked around her meditation garden, which was still filled with unauthorized scientific equipment, but no longer represented a potential threat to temporal stability. Dr. Harmony, would quantum field interaction studies on plant biology fall within the Parks Department's research authorization capabilities? Ms. Clark, if you can submit a proper research proposal and safety plan by tomorrow morning, I will consider authorizing a limited experimental program under Parks Department oversight. As Dr. Harmony departed, and Bolt began carefully packing up his temporal displacement equipment, Dawn realized that her simple suggestion to test with living plants had evolved into a carefully structured, scientific collaboration that might actually advance both horticulture and physics. Bolt, she said, as they surveyed the garden, I think we just figured out how to change the world without breaking any rules. Dawn, I believe we have discovered something more valuable than rule compliance. We have discovered how to transform revolutionary ideas into practical progress through collaborative problem solving. But as they began planning their authorized research proposal, neither of them realized that Dawn's simple suggestion about biological complexity would lead to discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between life, time, and the structure of reality itself. Sometimes the most dangerous ideas were the ones that seemed perfectly safe. 3 weeks into their officially sanctioned research collaboration, Dawn discovered that working with a quantum physicist was like gardening with someone who measured soil pH to 12 decimal places and wanted to understand the molecular structure of every earthworm. Dawn, Bolt announced, his bioelectric patterns crackling with the focused energy he displayed when deep in analytical mode. I have been studying your cultivation methods, and I believe you are intuitively applying principles of quantum field theory without realizing it. Dawn looked up from the experimental garden plots where she was tending their expanded collection of test plants. Everything from hardy dandelions to delicate andromedon, crystal flowers that required precise environmental conditions to survive. Bolt, I've been growing plants for 8 years using methods my grandmother taught me. I don't think quantum physics was involved. But observe your approach to soil preparation, Bolt continued, gesturing to the carefully layered growing medium Dawn had created for their research plants. You combine multiple organic components in specific ratios, allow them to interact over time until they achieve stable equilibrium, then introduce plant subjects into the optimized environment. That's just making good compost. That is creating a complex system with emergent properties that exceed the sum of its individual components, which is precisely what quantum field theory suggests is necessary for temporal stability. Dawn paused in her weeding to consider Bolt's observation. In 3 weeks of working together, she'd been amazed by his ability to find scientific principles hidden in activities she'd always considered purely practical. So you're saying my gardening methods accidentally follow physics theories I've never heard of? I am saying that your horticultural expertise represents empirical knowledge developed through generations of trial and error, which has independently arrived at conclusions that theoretical physics is only beginning to understand. Dawn sat back on her heels, processing this perspective on her work. That's either really flattering or kind of intimidating. It should be neither. It should be liberating. Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to the warm, steady frequency that Dawn had learned indicated contentment. For 18 months, I believed that my failure to achieve temporal displacement was due to insufficient theoretical knowledge. But working with you has taught me that the problem was insufficient practical wisdom. Over the past 3 weeks, their daily research sessions had evolved into conversations that ranged far beyond experimental protocols. Dawn had learned about Bolt's background as a perpetually anxious physicist who had spent his entire career rushing from one theoretical breakthrough to the next, never taking time to understand the practical implications of his work. Bolt, can I ask you something personal? Of course. When you first came to the meditation garden, you were always checking your chronometer, always rushing to the next thing. What were you so worried about being late for? Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to a frequency Dawn had never seen before, something that looked like embarrassment mixed with recognition. I was afraid of being irrelevant. In theoretical physics, reputation depends on publishing breakthrough results before other researchers reach the same conclusions. I believed that success required constant urgency, that any time spent on non-essential activities was time lost to competitors. And now I understand that the most essential activity was the thing I thought was least important, taking time to observe, to listen, to understand the practical realities that theoretical models attempt to describe. Dawn smiled as she returned to her weeding, noting how Bolt's chronic anxiety had gradually been replaced by focused curiosity over their weeks of collaboration. You know what's funny? I used to think science was all about complicated theories and expensive equipment, but working with you has taught me that some of the most sophisticated knowledge comes from just paying attention to what actually works. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sage Whisperwind, a renowned Zephyrian botanist whose translucent features had shifted to colors that indicated intense scientific excitement. Ms. Clark, Mr. Bolt, Dr. Whisperwind announced, her voice carrying the harmonic overtones that Zephyrians used for formal communications. I have reviewed your preliminary research findings, and I must say they represent some of the most intriguing intersections between biological systems and quantum mechanics I have encountered in 40 years of botanical research. Dawn felt a surge of pride mixed with surprise. In 3 weeks, their small-scale experiments had apparently attracted attention from the galactic scientific community. Dr. Whisperwind, we're honored by your interest, but we're really just testing some basic hypotheses about plant resilience under quantum field exposure. Ms. Clark, your basic hypotheses have demonstrated that naturally evolved biological systems exhibit quantum coherence properties that theoretical models predicted but had never been experimentally confirmed. Bolt's bioelectric patterns intensified with excitement. Dr. Whisperwind, are you saying our results have implications beyond temporal mechanics research? Mr. Bolt, your results suggest that the boundary between biological systems and quantum systems may be far more permeable than previously understood. The plants in your experimental garden are not just surviving quantum field exposure, they are actively interacting with quantum frequencies in ways that enhance their growth and stability. Dawn looked at their test plots with new appreciation. Over 3 weeks, she'd noticed that the plants exposed to Bolt's modified quantum fields were growing more vigorously than control specimens. But she'd attributed this to optimized growing conditions rather than quantum interactions. You mean the plants are actually benefiting from the quantum field exposure? Ms. Clark, the plants are not just benefiting, they appear to be communicating with the quantum fields. Your dandelions are exhibiting root growth patterns that correspond to quantum frequency modulations. Your crystal flowers are resonating with field fluctuations in ways that improve their photosynthetic efficiency. Bolt was consulting his data tablets with growing amazement. Dr. Whisperwind, if biological systems naturally interact with quantum fields, then temporal displacement may not require overcoming biological resistance to quantum manipulation. It may require learning to collaborate with biological quantum processes. Precisely. Mr. Bolt and Miss Clark's horticultural methods appear to optimize plants for exactly the kind of quantum collaboration that your temporal theories require. Dawn felt overwhelmed by the implications of what Dr. Whisperwind was describing. Are you saying that gardening techniques that have been passed down through generations might actually be quantum physics applications? Ms. Clark, I am saying that the distinction between practical and theoretical knowledge may be an artificial separation that has limited both fields. Your grandmother's composting methods create quantum coherent growing environments. Mr. Bolt's temporal equations describe quantum processes that biological systems already utilize naturally. The three researchers spent the afternoon reviewing data that revealed the extent to which they're simple. Plant experiments had been documenting previously unknown interactions between living systems and quantum fields. Dawn, Bolt said as they concluded their session, I need to confess something. When I first approached you for advice about accelerated growth techniques, I was essentially asking for help with my research without acknowledging the value of your expertise. What do you mean? I thought I was consulting a plant specialist about a physics problem, but I was actually collaborating with a quantum systems expert who had spent 8 years developing practical applications that theoretical physics had never achieved. Dawn laughed. Bolt, I still don't understand half the equations you show me. I just know what works with plants. That is exactly what makes our collaboration so powerful. You understand quantum systems from the perspective of practical results, rather than theoretical abstractions. I understand quantum theory from the perspective of mathematical models, rather than living applications. So we're both half right? We are both completely right about different aspects of the same phenomena. Together, we have access to comprehensive understanding that neither of us could achieve independently. As they cleaned up their research materials, Dawn reflected on how dramatically her understanding of her own work had evolved over 3 weeks of collaboration with Bolt. Bolt, when we started this project, I thought I was just helping you test some theories about plants and time travel. But it feels like we've discovered something much bigger. Dawn, we have discovered that the most profound scientific advances emerge from combining different types of expertise rather than from increasing specialization within individual fields. You mean that gardeners and physicists have things to learn from each other? I mean that the artificial boundaries between different types of knowledge have been preventing breakthrough discoveries that require interdisciplinary collaboration. Their conversation was interrupted by Dawn's communication device, alerting her to an incoming message from Dr. Harmony at the Parks Department. Dawn, I hope your research is progressing well, because I have just received a visit from representatives of the Galactic Temporal Research Council. They are extremely interested in your experimental results and would like to schedule a formal evaluation of your methodologies. Dawn looked at Bolt, whose bioelectric patterns had shifted to a frequency that indicated both excitement and apprehension. The Temporal Research Council wants to evaluate our work? Dawn, the Temporal Research Council represents the galaxy's most advanced time manipulation researchers. If they are interested in our plant-based quantum field studies, it suggests that our collaboration may have implications for temporal mechanics research throughout the galaxy. Is that good or bad? It means that our simple experiments with dandelions and compost have attracted the attention of scientists who specialize in the most complex theoretical challenges in galactic physics. Dawn sat down on her favorite garden bench, trying to process the idea that her traditional plant care methods had somehow contributed to cutting-edge physics research. Bolt, when we started working together, you were anxious because you thought you were running out of time to make discoveries before other researchers beat you to breakthrough results. Yes, and I was just happy to have someone who appreciated how complex and interesting plants actually are. Yes? So how did we end up collaborating on research that might change how the entire galaxy understands quantum mechanics and time travel? Bolt settled beside her on the bench, his bioelectric patterns cycling through the contemplative frequency that had become familiar during their philosophical conversations. Dawn, I believe we succeeded because we stopped trying to rush toward predetermined outcomes and started paying attention to what was actually happening in front of us. You mean we made discoveries by slowing down? We made discoveries by combining urgency about important questions with patience about finding answers. We married theoretical curiosity with practical wisdom. As they sat together in the peaceful meditation garden that had become the site of potentially revolutionary scientific collaboration, Dawn realized that their research had changed both of them in ways that went far beyond professional advancement. Bolt, I have a confession too. When you first started visiting the garden, I thought you were just another stressed-out person who needed somewhere quiet to think. I never imagined that helping you with plant questions would lead to the most interesting conversations I've ever had about ... Well, anything. Dawn, you gave me something more valuable than research assistance. You taught me that the most important discoveries emerge from relationships based on mutual respect and genuine curiosity, rather than from individual brilliance and competitive urgency. Tomorrow, they would present their findings to representatives of the Galactic Temporal Research Council, potentially launching their collaborative insights into the broader scientific community. But tonight, they were just two people who had learned that the best way to understand complex problems was to find someone whose knowledge complemented your own. Then take the time to really listen to what they had to say. Sometimes the most revolutionary science emerged from the simplest human connections. The morning of the Galactic Temporal Research Council evaluation, Dawn arrived at Unity Park to find the meditation garden transformed into what looked like a scientific symposium. Representatives from 12 different species had assembled around her carefully tended experimental plots. Their various forms of technology creating a cacophony of beeping, humming, and electromagnetic interference that was making her hybrid plants visibly agitated. Dawn, Bolt called out, his bioelectric patterns crackling with an anxiety level she hadn't seen since their first meeting. The council representatives have been here since dawn, conducting preliminary assessments of our experimental setup. I believe they may be skeptical of our methodologies. Dawn approached the assembled scientists, noting the expressions of polite academic interest, mixed with barely concealed condescension that she'd learned to recognize from university researchers who attended Parks Department presentations. Dr. Meridian Thoughtweaver announced an imposing Rigelian whose tentacles were arranged in patterns that conveyed formal authority. Representing the Temporal Research Council's Theoretical Physics Division, Ms. Clark, we are here to evaluate claims that traditional horticultural practices have achieved. Quantum field manipulations that our most advanced research facilities have been unable to replicate. Dawn felt her stomach tighten. The way Dr. Thoughtweaver phrased their research made it sound like they'd been making ridiculous claims about magical plant powers rather than documenting interesting interactions between biological systems and quantum fields. Dr. Thoughtweaver, we haven't claimed that gardening methods are superior to advanced physics research. We've just observed that plants seem to respond well to quantum field exposure when they're grown in optimal conditions. Ms. Clark, our preliminary scans indicate that your optimal conditions include growing mediums with quantum coherence properties that theoretical models suggest should be impossible to achieve without sophisticated field manipulation equipment. Dr. Flux Harmony, Dawn's supervisor, stepped forward with the expression of someone trying to manage a situation that was spiraling beyond her administrative capabilities. Dr. Thoughtweaver, perhaps we could review the experimental data before making conclusions about the theoretical implications. Dr. Harmony, we have reviewed 3 weeks of data that suggests quantum field interactions are occurring in your public park that rival the most advanced laboratory results in galactic physics. Such claims require extraordinary verification. Dawn watched Bolt's bioelectric patterns shift rapidly between frequencies that indicated panic, frustration, and defensive anger. The collaborative excitement that had characterized their research was being overwhelmed by institutional pressure and academic skepticism. Dr. Thoughtweaver, Bolt interjected, his voice taking on the rapid-fire quality that accompanied his most stressed moments. Our research methodology follows established protocols for quantum field measurement and biological response analysis. The results are anomalous, but they are scientifically documented. Mr. Bolt, your research methodology appears to consist of informal conversations with a Parks Department employee about traditional plant care, followed by modified applications of restricted temporal manipulation technology in an unsupervised public environment. Dawn felt anger rising at the dismissive way Dr. Thoughtweaver was characterizing their careful, thoughtful collaboration. Dr. Thoughtweaver, with respect, you're describing our work as if we just randomly combined gardening with physics equipment. We've spent weeks studying how biological systems and quantum fields interact, documenting results, and developing hypotheses based on empirical observations. Ms. Clark, empirical observations require controlled experimental conditions, peer review, and replication by qualified researchers. Gardening experiments conducted in public parks do not meet the standards for scientific validity. Dr. Sage Whisperwind, a Zephyrian botanist who had championed their research, moved to examine the experimental plots with visible concern. Colleagues, she announced, her translucent features shifting to colors that indicated alarm, there appears to be a problem with the quantum field interactions we've been monitoring. Dawn looked at her experimental plants and immediately saw what Dr. Whisperwind meant. The dandelions that had been thriving under quantum field exposure were now showing signs of stress-wilted leaves, browning at the edges, root systems that appeared to be retracting from the soil. What's happening to them? Dawn asked, kneeling beside the plants she'd been caring for over the past 3 weeks. Bolt consulted his monitoring equipment with increasing agitation. The quantum field measurements are showing irregular fluctuations. The stable resonance patterns we documented over the past weeks have become erratic and unpredictable. Dr. Thoughtweaver's tentacles arranged themselves in patterns that conveyed professional vindication. This deterioration confirms our concerns about unsupervised quantum field research. Biological systems exposed to uncontrolled quantum manipulation inevitably experience cellular breakdown. But they've been fine for 3 weeks, Dawn protested, examining the soil conditions around her plants. The growing medium is still optimal. The environmental factors haven't changed. The plants were healthy yesterday. Ms. Clark, Dr. Thoughtweaver explained with the patronizing tone that academics used when correcting obvious errors. Biological quantum interactions are inherently unstable. Initial positive responses are typically followed by systemic failure, as cellular structures are overwhelmed by quantum field stress. Dawn felt her heart sinking as she watched plants she'd carefully nurtured beginning to fail in front of an audience of skeptical scientists. But something about the pattern of deterioration bothered her. It didn't look like the gradual stress responses she'd observed when plants were exposed to unsuitable conditions. Bolt, she said quietly, when did you last recalibrate the quantum field generators? I performed standard calibration checks yesterday evening, just as I have every day since we began the experiments. And the field strength has remained constant? Yes. The quantum field parameters have been maintained within optimal ranges according to my calculations. Dawn stood up and looked around the meditation garden, noting that the assembled scientific equipment had been positioned differently than their usual experimental setup. Dr. Thoughtweaver, how long have your monitoring devices been active in the garden? We began preliminary scans at dawn to establish baseline measurements before the formal evaluation. Dawn felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together. And where are your devices positioned relative to our experimental plots? Dr. Thoughtweaver gestured to the various pieces of console equipment that surrounded the garden. We have established a comprehensive monitoring perimeter to ensure accurate data collection from all angles. Bolt, Dawn said, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had just realized the scope of a problem. What happens when multiple quantum field generators operate in close proximity? Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to a frequency that indicated alarm mixed with understanding. Field interference patterns. Multiple generators can create quantum resonance conflicts that destabilize the very phenomena they're attempting to measure. So the Council's monitoring equipment isn't just observing our experiments, it's interfering with them? Dr. Whisperwind was consulting her own botanical scanners with growing concern. Dawn, the plant stress patterns are consistent with quantum field conflict rather than cellular breakdown from excessive exposure. The biological systems aren't failing because they can't handle quantum interactions. They're failing because they're receiving conflicting quantum signals. Dr. Thoughtweaver's formal authority began to show cracks as the implications of this realization became apparent. That would suggest that our monitoring methodology has inadvertently disrupted the experimental conditions we came to evaluate. Not just disrupted, Bolt said, his anxiety being replaced by focused analytical energy, potentially invalidated. If our plants have been thriving under stable quantum field conditions for 3 weeks, and they begin failing only when additional quantum generators are introduced, then the failure demonstrates the importance of quantum field stability rather than the limitations of biological quantum interactions. Dawn looked at her suffering plants and at the assembled scientists whose expensive monitoring equipment had accidentally sabotaged the very phenomena they'd come to study. Dr. Thoughtweaver, would it be possible to temporarily shut down the Council's monitoring devices to see if the plants recover when the quantum field conflicts are eliminated? Ms. Clark, that would compromise our ability to collect comprehensive data during the evaluation process. But it would also test whether your monitoring equipment is the cause of the plant failures you're using to question our research validity. The garden fell silent as the assembled scientists processed the implications of what Dawn was proposing. Their sophisticated evaluation methodology had potentially created the very problems they were expecting to find. Dr. Harmony, who had been watching this exchange with growing administrative concern, stepped forward. Dr. Thoughtweaver, if the Council's equipment is interfering with the experimental conditions, wouldn't that mean your evaluation is based on artificially created failure rather than inherent limitations of the research approach? Dr. Harmony, scientific evaluation requires comprehensive monitoring to ensure accurate assessment of experimental claims. But comprehensive monitoring that changes the experimental conditions isn't scientific evaluation. It's experimental contamination, Bolt interjected, his confidence returning as he applied his theoretical knowledge to the practical problem they were facing. Dawn made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Dr. Thoughtweaver, I'm going to shut down our quantum field generators completely. Dawn, Bolt said, alarmed. That will end our experiment and potentially compromise weeks of research. No, it will test whether quantum field stability is more important than quantum field strength. If the plants start recovering when all quantum generators are offline, that supports our hypothesis about biological systems needing stable rather than powerful quantum environments. Dawn began the shutdown sequence for their experimental equipment, ignoring the protests from several council representatives who wanted to maintain monitoring capabilities. And if the plants continue to deteriorate after the quantum fields are eliminated, Dr. Thoughtweaver asked, then you'll be right that our research was based on unsustainable biological responses to quantum manipulation. And we'll accept that conclusion. As Dawn completed the shutdown of their quantum field generators, the garden's electromagnetic environment shifted dramatically. The humming and beeping from multiple monitoring devices continued, but the underlying quantum resonance that had characterized their experimental space for 3 weeks disappeared. Within minutes, Dawn could see the plants beginning to respond. The stressed dandelions stopped wilting, their leaves began to straighten, and their root systems resumed normal activity. The plants are recovering, Dr. Whisperwind announced, her botanical scanners confirming what everyone could observe visually. Cellular stress indicators are decreasing rapidly now that the experimental quantum fields have been eliminated. But that suggests that our quantum field exposure was beneficial rather than harmful, Bolt realized. The plants are showing stress when the fields are in conflict or absent, but they were thriving when the fields were stable and consistent. Dr. Thoughtweaver consulted his monitoring devices with visible confusion. If the biological systems were healthier under stable quantum field exposure than under normal conditions, that would indicate quantum biological interactions that exceed anything we've achieved in controlled laboratory environments. Dawn looked around the garden at the assembled scientists, all of whom were now observing plant recovery that contradicted their expectations about biological responses to quantum field manipulation. Dr. Thoughtweaver, I think our research has demonstrated something none of us expected. Plants don't just tolerate quantum field exposure. They appear to prefer stable quantum environments to normal conditions. But they can't handle quantum field conflicts any better than they can handle drought or poor soil. Which means, Bolt added, his excitement returning as he processed the implications, that successful biological quantum interactions require environmental stability and consistent field parameters, not just powerful quantum generation equipment. Dr. Whisperwind was documenting the plant recovery with growing amazement. Colleagues, we may be observing evidence that biological systems are naturally adapted to quantum field interactions, and that our laboratory failures have resulted from inadequate attention to environmental stability rather than inherent incompatibility between biology and quantum mechanics. As the council representatives began recalibrating their evaluation based on this unexpected demonstration, Dawn realized that their simple plant experiment had revealed fundamental flaws in how the galaxy's most advanced physicists approached biological quantum research. "Dr. Thoughtweaver," she said, "I think our evaluation has taught us something important about the difference between studying quantum interactions and creating conditions where quantum interactions can be studied effectively. Sometimes the most important scientific discoveries emerged from recognizing that the tools being used to study a phenomenon were actually preventing that phenomenon from occurring naturally." As the Galactic Temporal Research Council representatives began dismantling their monitoring equipment, Dawn found herself in the surreal position of explaining advanced quantum biological theory to the galaxies, leading physicists using nothing but 8 years of gardening experience. "The thing about plants," Dawn said, kneeling beside her recovered dandelions, while a dozen alien scientists took notes, "is that they tell you what they need if you know how to listen." These guys were happy and healthy under stable quantum field conditions, stressed when the fields were in conflict, and recovering now that the interference has been eliminated. Dr. Meridian Thoughtweaver, whose initial skepticism had been replaced by grudging scientific curiosity, consulted his recalibrated readings with visible confusion. "Ms. Clark, your biological subjects appear to be demonstrating quantum coherence properties that our theoretical models suggest should require sophisticated technological augmentation to achieve." "Dr. Thoughtweaver, maybe the problem is that your theoretical models assume quantum interactions are artificial processes that need to be imposed on biological systems, when they're actually natural processes that need to be allowed to develop without interference." Bolt's bioelectric patterns were cycling through frequencies that Dawn had learned to recognize as intense intellectual processing mixed with excitement. "Dawn, you're describing quantum field research methodology that contradicts fundamental assumptions about the relationship between controlled conditions and experimental validity." "Bolt, I'm describing plant care methodology that recognizes the difference between creating optimal conditions and trying to control natural processes." Dr. Sage Whisperwind, who had been documenting the plant recovery with botanical scanners, looked up from her data with the expression of someone whose worldview was being gently but thoroughly reorganized. "Ms. Clark, are you suggesting that successful biological quantum research requires horticultural expertise rather than advanced physics knowledge?" Dr. Whisperwind, I'm suggesting that successful biological quantum research requires understanding how biological systems actually work, not just how we think they should work according to physics theories. Dawn stood up and gestured toward the experimental garden plots, where multiple plant species from different worlds were thriving in carefully cultivated soil mixtures that she'd optimized through years of trial and error. "Look at this growing medium. It's not just dirt. It's a complex ecosystem of microorganisms, mineral nutrients, organic compounds, and symbiotic relationships that took months to develop and balance. You can't replicate this system in a sterile laboratory because sterility eliminates the biological complexity that makes quantum interactions possible." Dr. Thoughtweaver was documenting Dawn's soil composition with the intensity of someone who had discovered that the key to advanced physics had been hiding in a gardening manual. "Ms. Clark, you're describing quantum coherent biological environments that have been developed through traditional agricultural methods rather than sophisticated technology." Dr. Thoughtweaver, I'm describing good soil, but apparently good soil for plants is also good soil for quantum field interactions, because plants that are healthy enough to thrive in complex growing conditions are also robust enough to participate in quantum processes. Bolt moved to examine the monitoring equipment that had been causing quantum field interference, his analytical mind processing the implications of what their accidental experiment had demonstrated. Dawn, I believe we've discovered that quantum field research has been failing, not because biological systems can't handle quantum interactions, but because research methodologies have been eliminating the biological conditions that make quantum interactions possible. You mean scientists have been trying so hard to control experiments that they've been preventing the phenomena they're trying to study? Precisely. Sterile laboratory conditions, isolated test subjects, simplified variables, all the methodological approaches designed to ensure experimental precision have been eliminating the biological complexity that quantum coherence requires. Dr. Whisper Wind was consulting her botanical databases with growing excitement. Colleagues, if Ms. Clark's horticultural methods can create quantum coherent biological environments using traditional gardening techniques, then quantum biological research may require interdisciplinary collaboration between physics and agriculture rather than advanced technological development. Dawn felt overwhelmed by the implications of what the assembled scientists were discovering through her simple plant care methods. Dr. Whisper Wind, I still don't understand most of the quantum physics you're all discussing. I just know that plants do better when you treat them like complex living systems rather than simple experimental subjects. Ms. Clark, Dr. Thoughtweaver said, his formal tone softening with what appeared to be genuine respect, your practical knowledge has identified fundamental flaws in theoretical approaches that have limited quantum physics research for decades. The distinction between simple and complex may be the key insight that advances beyond current limitations. As the afternoon progressed, Dawn found herself collaborating with quantum physicists to develop research protocols that combined advanced theoretical knowledge with traditional gardening wisdom. Instead of imposing artificial conditions on biological subjects, they would create optimal natural conditions that allowed quantum interactions to develop organically. Dawn, Bolt said as they finalized their collaborative research proposal, I want to apologize for initially approaching you as a consultant rather than a collaborator. I thought I needed technical assistance with a physics problem, when I actually needed partnership with someone whose expertise complemented my theoretical knowledge. Bolt, you don't need to apologize. Neither of us knew what this collaboration would become when we started talking about accelerated growth techniques 3 weeks ago. But that's exactly why the collaboration succeeded. We approached each other with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined expectations about what we could learn. Dr. Thoughtweaver, who had spent the day documenting experimental results that challenged his professional assumptions, approached Dawn with a formal request that surprised everyone present. Ms. Clark, the Temporal Research Council would like to invite you to serve as a consultant on biological applications of quantum field theory. Your practical expertise appears to be essential for advancing research that has been stalled by purely theoretical approaches. Dawn looked around the meditation garden that had become the site of potentially revolutionary scientific collaboration. Then at Bolt, whose chronic anxiety had been replaced by the focused excitement of someone engaged in meaningful work. Dr. Thoughtweaver, I'm honored by the invitation, but I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you inviting me to help develop quantum physics research, or are you asking me to teach quantum physicists about gardening? Ms. Clark, we are asking you to help us understand how traditional practical knowledge and advanced theoretical knowledge can be combined to achieve results that neither approach could accomplish independently. In other words, you want to learn how to grow quantum interactions the same way I grow plants? We want to learn how to create conditions where quantum interactions can develop naturally rather than trying to force them to occur artificially. Dawn considered the proposal, thinking about the implications of applying her gardening philosophy to galactic physics research. Dr. Thoughtweaver, I'll accept your invitation, but I have one condition. What is that? Any research we develop has to be accessible to people who don't have advanced physics degrees. If quantum biological interactions are natural processes that can be optimized through traditional methods, then they should be understandable and applicable by anyone who's willing to learn. You want to democratize quantum physics research? I want to make sure that breakthrough discoveries don't get locked away in specialized laboratories where only experts can access them. If gardeners can contribute to quantum research, then maybe quantum research can contribute to gardening. Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to the warm, steady frequency that Dawn had learned indicated deep contentment. Dawn, you're proposing that advanced science should be developed in ways that make it useful to everyday life rather than separate from everyday experience. I'm proposing that the most advanced science emerges from understanding everyday experience more deeply, not from escaping everyday experience into abstract theories. As the day concluded with formal agreements for expanded research collaboration between the Parks Department and the Galactic Temporal Research Council, Dawn realized that her simple suggestion to test quantum theories with living plants had evolved into a fundamental reconsideration of how scientific knowledge should be developed and shared. Bolt, she said as they walked through the garden in the evening light, do you still think we're going to discover time travel through our plant experiments? Dawn, I think we've discovered something more valuable than time travel. We've discovered that the most important breakthroughs emerge from combining different types of expertise rather than from perfecting individual specializations. You mean gardeners and physicists working together? I mean anyone who understands something deeply working with anyone else who understands something else deeply, until their combined knowledge creates possibilities that neither could achieve alone. As they tended to their plants under the growing starlight, both Dawn and Bolt understood that their collaboration had discovered something profound about the relationship between practical wisdom and theoretical knowledge, between traditional methods and innovative applications, between simple questions and complex answers. Sometimes the most revolutionary discoveries emerged from the most fundamental insight that the people who understood different pieces of a puzzle should probably start talking to each other. 2 years after Don Clark accidentally revolutionized quantum physics by suggesting that Bolt test his temporal theories on dandelions, the Unity Park Botanical Research Center had become the most visited scientific facility in the known galaxy. The waiting list for our practical quantum gardening workshops is now extending to 18 months. Dawn told the assembled delegates at the Galactic Scientific Collaboration Summit, addressing an audience that included Nobel laureates, university presidents, and government ministers from 47 different worlds. What started as a simple conversation between a stressed physicist and a curious florist has evolved into educational programs that combine traditional agricultural wisdom with cutting-edge theoretical research, producing results that neither field could achieve independently. Dawn clicked to her next presentation slide, showing images of community gardens throughout the galaxy where residents were growing food using quantum-enhanced growing techniques that had emerged from her collaboration with Bolt. The most significant discovery wasn't that plants can interact with quantum fields, though they can, and do in remarkable ways. The most significant discovery was that breakthrough innovation emerges from combining practical experience with theoretical knowledge, from treating everyday expertise as scientifically valuable rather than scientifically irrelevant. In the audience, Bolt watched his former research partner with bioelectric patterns that indicated pride, contentment, and the deep satisfaction that came from work that had meaningful impact beyond individual achievement. Their collaboration had produced more than advanced research. It had created a new model for how scientific knowledge could be developed. Through partnerships between specialists and practitioners, between theorists and people who understood practical applications, the Harmony Method, as their approach had come to be known throughout galactic academia, was now being applied to challenges ranging from interstellar agriculture to renewable energy development to interspecies communication protocols. Dr. Don Clark, announced Chancellor Meridian Starbright from the Galactic University Consortium, on behalf of educational institutions throughout known space, I want to express our gratitude for your contributions to what historians are calling the second renaissance of collaborative science. Dawn smiled at the formal recognition, but her real satisfaction came from the letters she received daily from gardeners, farmers, and community organizers who are using quantum-enhanced growing techniques to improve food security on worlds throughout the galaxy. Chancellor Starbright, the most important outcome of our research isn't the advanced physics applications, it's the demonstration that complex problems require diverse expertise. That innovation happens fastest when different types of knowledge are combined rather than isolated. After the presentation, Dawn found herself surrounded by researchers, educators, and policymakers who wanted to understand how to apply collaborative methodology to their own challenges. But the conversation that mattered most came from Dr. Bolt himself, who had transformed from an anxiously rushed physicist into a thoughtful researcher whose work focused on making advanced science accessible to practical applications. Dawn, Bolt said, as they walked through the expanded botanical research gardens that now occupied most of Unity Park. I have been reflecting on our collaboration, and I realize that you taught me something more valuable than quantum biological interactions. What's that? You taught me that the most important scientific discoveries emerge from relationships based on mutual respect and genuine curiosity rather than from individual brilliance competing for recognition. They paused beside the memorial garden they had created to honor Dawn's grandmother, whose traditional composting methods had inadvertently provided the theoretical foundation for quantum-coherent growing environments. Bolt, you taught me that practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge aren't separate things. They're different ways of understanding the same phenomena. My grandmother's gardening methods weren't just practical. They were applications of principles that physics hadn't discovered yet. And my quantum equations weren't just theoretical. They were descriptions of processes that gardeners had been utilizing for generations without knowing the underlying mechanisms. Their conversation was interrupted by a group of young students from the Interspecies Academy who approached with the excitement that Dawn had learned to associate with people who were discovering that science was more accessible than they'd believed. Dr. Clark, Dr. Bolt, called out Zara, a teenage Rigelian whose tentacles were arranged in patterns that indicated enthusiastic curiosity. We've been working on the quantum composting project you assigned, and we think we figured out how to optimize growing conditions for andromedin crystal flowers using earthworm castings. Dawn felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from watching young people discover that they could contribute to advanced research through careful observation and creative thinking. That's fantastic, Zara. What made you think of combining andromedin and earth growing techniques? Well, you always say that the best solutions come from understanding what different species do well and finding ways to combine their strengths rather than trying to make one approach work for everything. Bolt's bioelectric patterns shifted to the frequency Dawn recognized as deep appreciation for educational success. Zara, you have applied collaborative methodology to develop agricultural innovation that experienced researchers had not considered. That represents exactly the kind of thinking that advances both practical applications and theoretical understanding. As the students continued describing their research project with the enthusiasm of young people who had discovered that their ideas mattered to adults doing important work, Dawn realized that their most lasting impact wouldn't be measured in scientific publications or technological applications. Their most lasting impact would be the generation of students who had learned that everyone's knowledge was valuable, that the most interesting discoveries emerged from combining different perspectives, and that science was something they could participate in rather than just observe. Dawn, Bolt said as they concluded their conversation with the students, I want to tell you something I have never said to a research collaborator. What's that? Thank you, not for the professional achievements or the scientific recognition, but for teaching me that the most meaningful work emerges from caring about other people's success rather than competing for individual advancement. Dawn looked around Unity Park, where families from dozens of different species were enjoying the expanded gardens, where students were conducting research projects that combined traditional knowledge with advanced theory, where community members were learning that they could contribute to scientific understanding through careful observation and creative thinking. Bolt, I think we discovered something more important than quantum biological interactions or time travel applications. What did we discover? We discovered that when people with different types of expertise start listening to each other with genuine curiosity and mutual respect, They can solve problems that seemed impossible when they were working alone. You mean that collaboration is more powerful than individual brilliance? I mean that collaboration is how individual brilliance becomes useful to other people instead of just impressive to other experts. 5 years after their first conversation in the meditation garden, Dawn, Clark, and Bolt had become symbols of what the galaxy's educators called applied collaboration, the recognition that breakthrough innovation emerged from combining different types of knowledge rather than from perfecting individual specializations. But more importantly, they had remained friends who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who continued to learn from each other's perspectives, and who had discovered that the most rewarding work was always shared work. Sometimes changing the galaxy was less about discovering new technologies and more about rediscovering old wisdom, that the most complex problems were solved by people who cared enough about each other to really listen to what each person knew best. The quantum mechanics were just a bonus.